So hi everyone, my name's Amy. I'm the current student representative on the ACNS Executive Committee, and I'm delighted to be hosting this webinar about academic publishing today. Before we get started properly, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional owners of the land on which I live and work. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples we have here with us today. Sorry, I'm still recovering from COVID. So we have three fantastic speakers lined up today, and they'll be sharing their insights into academic publishing. In the interest of time, we're going to hear from each presenter in turn, and then we'll take questions at the end. So if you have any questions that come up during the presentations, please feel free to add them to the Q&A box at the bottom. All right, let's get started. So our first speaker today is Ginny Barbour. Ginny is a professor and co-lead of the Office of Scholarly Communications at Queensland University of Technology. She's also editor-in-chief of the Medical Journal of Australia and a director of Open Access Australia. Over to you, Ginny.
Great, thanks very much. I'll share my screen. All right, hopefully that's looking good. So thanks very much for the introduction. Really happy to be here today. I also pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land that I'm on. I'm in beautiful Meanjin in Brisbane, on the lands of the Turrbal and Niagara people. And I'd like to just acknowledge that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have always been sharers of knowledge and the keepers of knowledge across Australia. And I'm just really aware that, you know, we're at a time at the moment when it's really important to speak up for the rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So I am going to do a really quick trip through open access and through publishing with my two hats on. I am the director of Open Access Australasia, actually, which I'm delighted to say includes Australia and New Zealand. And I also am editor-in-chief at MJA, and I'm actually now an adjunct at QUT, so I still have a bit of a finger in that particular pie. So just what are we? So we're a diverse membership across Australia and outer in New Zealand. We have 31 universities. I would just say to you, if your university is not on this list, we are always looking for more members because it helps us to advocate nationally. We're the major organisation nationally advocating for open access across Australia and New Zealand. I won't go into lots of details, but I will just say that the two principles that I think will probably speak to people in this this webinar is that we have equity in scholarly communication. So that's both to access research, but also importantly, as we move to open access, to be able to publish. And the support for a diverse ecosystem of open access approaches, and that's really critical. You know, at a time when we know that there's a lot of dominance of big publishers within this space, the importance of having a sort of diverse ecosystem has never been more critical. We do a whole bunch of things. All of our resources are open. They're fully licensed under an open access license, so you can reuse them. One of the things we also do right now, we're preparing for Open Access Week, which is happening at the end of this of October. Last year's one, which is up here, is Open for Climate Justice. This year's one is around community over commercialisation, and we think there's going to be some really interesting conversations happening there. So just encourage you to have a look at that and participate. So this is what I'm going to talk about. Quick trip through open access and open science policy, kind of the bits of it that I think would be relevant to you. And then I'm going to sort of switch hats, put my MJ one on, talk about what does a journal really look for and what helps in getting published. And obviously, you know, this is a really short talk. You're more than welcome to send me ideas or questions afterwards, or we can talk about them, particularly about some of the details, which I obviously can't kind of go into here. So what do you kind of need to know? So first off, I think I've been using this slide for a while, and it's really, really important because open access is much more than free access. So free access is you can download a PDF, you might be able to use it, might be time limited. During the COVID pandemic, for example, we knew that a lot of papers were made freely available. Some publishers have now decided that as the pandemic is waning, they're choosing to put those papers that were freely available back behind paywalls. So they're not fully open. So essentially, you're using them at the publisher's whim and discretion. So open access critically is immediate free access, but it also includes this concept of retention of copyright by the author, reuse rights, There's a license associated with it. So this logo here, the CC BY, is the most common one, the Creative Commons Attribution License, which means you can do anything with the paper or research object provided you properly attribute the author. And that critically, you also have permanent archiving and linking, and all of these are part of what open access really is. So I would just encourage you, if you're not quite clear about that in the things that you're reading, particularly in the things that you're sharing, to think really critically about whether something that you're producing is fully open access. And even more importantly, open access is just part of open science. So the most important development that's happened recently is the UNESCO Open Science Recommendation, which was adopted in November 2021, and both Australia and New Zealand are part of UNESCO, so they kind of agreed to this. And you can see here that open access includes not just open access to research publications and research data, but also it includes things like open infrastructure, open dialogue with other knowledge systems, so for example citizen science, and engagement with societal actors and indigenous knowledges comes into this as well. So there's an enormous amount of work going on globally around this, and one of the things that's actually going to be happening quite soon is that countries will be required to report against how they're doing on open science. And I'm kind of here to tell you that unfortunately neither Australia nor New Zealand currently have this as a kind of priority within government at either level. So anything that you can do to advocate for that would be fantastic, and we're certainly doing that. This is the text of the open recommendation. I won't go into it, but I think it's just really important to note that first off, it is it's intended to be it was the first global definition of open science. It is kind of now recognised as sort of something that everybody's working from. Critically, it includes all scientific disciplines and scholarly practices. So even if you're in the humanities, that's included in its science in its widest term. And it has these key pillars at the bottom I've talked about that include not just open access, but also sort of all the parts of it. And this is really where we're trying to go as a global movement, really, because we know that it's important to share research openly and in a way so we can sort of address society's big challenges. And although it's written in very UN speak, it's actually quite fantastic to read. I was lucky enough to be involved in one part of it when it was being drafted, and something that came out was how carefully language was drafted to be really inclusive, to get everybody on board. And that's how these things happen internationally. There's a whole piece of work that's going on right now to promote this and to kind of get it onto the various agendas. The key one, actually, the one that I'm focusing on in particular, is around promoting a common understanding of open science. But the other one that's probably relevant for you as you're doing your research is number 5, which is this idea of fostering a culture of open science and aligning incentives for that. And that's something that institutions in particular should be paying attention to. And there are kind of bodies of work that are being done to get institutions to try and take this up. It's all underpinned by values and principles that you wouldn't be surprised by. But again, it's one of these examples where if you don't have proper values and principles underlying it, then you can end up with developing something that that goes in the wrong direction. So I think that's why it's become really important internationally. But I think it's just fair to say that in Australia and New Zealand, this policy is moving in the same direction. So Cathy Foley, Australia's chief scientist, named open access as one of her pillars of her work. You'll probably be, if you have a grant from the NHMRC or you work with anyone who does, you'll be aware that the NHMRC has updated its open access policy. It requires all of the research that it funds going forward to be immediately and fully open access with a Creative Commons Attribution license associated with it, and that will be something that they will be monitoring going forward. I'm on one of the NHMRC committees, and this is a piece of work is happening right now to develop how they're going to monitor that. In New Zealand, the Prime Minister's Chief Science Advisor has also taken up the cause of open access. MB, which is one of the funders there, has a policy on open research, and pretty much any university within Australia or New Zealand has some sort of open access or open science policy, or it is actively being discussed. So there's a lot of resources out there that are available to you, and I think that it's pretty clear that the question is not whether we have open access or open science, but kind of how we get there. And this is what's happening with publications. This is from Figshire. It was a couple of sort of ends at the end of 21, but you can see that we have now passed the point at which open access is becoming the norm. What we're seeing down here at the bottom, in the bottom right one, is kind of interesting, and I apologise. One of the terrible things about open access is that all the kind of terminology associated with it. So green open access means repository access in repositories. Gold open access means public open access via publications. It may or may not be paid open access through the journals. But what we can see here is that it's accelerating through the journals, and that's both good but also something that we need to be aware of as a challenge. So how can you make your work open? So this is kind of a nice image, and well, I've got a bit of a I kind of have an interest in it. So this is something that I originally drafted, and then a colleague called Thomas Shaffey, who works on Wikipedia in a number of different areas, took this and adapted it because we'd both put Creative Commons licenses on it. I can now readapt it, and it's a nice example of how, you know, reuse works in real time. So there are 3 ways I just encourage you to think of. So the first one is preprints. The second one is postprints, which is more often called author-accepted manuscripts. So that's the final version that's been peer-reviewed by the journal, been accepted by them, but not yet typeset. And then there's the published version. This is what goes online at the journals. So I would say to you that if you're keen on openly sharing, I would really encourage you to think about preprints. There are many preprint repositories that are appropriate for your disciplines now. It doesn't stop you publishing in most journals now. Virtually all journals allow them. There's good evidence to show that it increases the reach of your research, and it probably increases the citations of your research. So that's a really great thing to do. Second one is that and something you should always do is you should always put a copy of your paper in your institutional repository. That might be the author accepted version, as here. This is from QUT ePrints, or it may be the fully published version if it's fully open access. And then the final way to make things open is in a fully open access journal. And those can either be journals that are open, the entire content is open, or ones where parts of it are open through, for example, a read and publish deal. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. I guess the things that I hear all the time that people are interested in is these are probably the 3 main questions that come up when I'm talking to people about open access. The first one is that there's tons of journals out there. How do I know whether they're legitimate or not? Well, there are some really good tools to look at that. So there's this thing called Think, Check, Submit. The main one I would say, to boil it down into one thing, is if you don't read the journal, then don't consider publishing there. That's probably the simplest thing to think about. Second thing is around can't afford to pay for open access. Well, there is a lot of work going on to try and get rid of author side fees. There are journals that you don't have to pay to publish in. If you are at an institution in Australia or New Zealand, it's likely that your university is part of deals with that have been negotiated by the Council of Australian University Librarians, and I've put a link up there. There's a lot of publishers are part of that now. And if you can't do that and you're publishing in a journal and you can't afford the article processing charge, put a copy in your university repository. And then how to pick a license. Well, something just to have a quick look at here is there's a really great tool on the Creative Commons license site, which walks you through what you want to do with it. So it's not complicated, and there are lots of tools out there to use. Okay, so all right. What else needs to be open? Just remember, it's important that you make your data open. You need to be thinking about putting your code in open repositories. Really think about protocols and registration, in particular if you're doing clinical research. That's really critical, but in other areas of research as well. And then one thing I think it's always worth having some thoughts on and being aware of is peer review and the processes around making that open. Okay, so last bit, I'm just going to quickly talk about what a journal looks like and how it helps you to get published. So the first thing I would say is, you know this, there are so many journals out there. They've all got different requirements. Unfortunately, they're not going to ever agree on what the requirements are. So the first thing I would just say is please read the author instructions for all the journal that you're submitting to. All editors try to do their best to show what they're looking for. I work in a journal where we get 1,300 submissions a year, and I would say approximately half of them are never going to be appropriate for our journal. So they go straight out the door without, and it's a waste of time for academics submitting, and it's not a great use of the editorial time. So read the journal's instructions. Second thing is think about your cover letters and your titles in your abstract. And these are sort of often kind of, I think people don't pay much attention to them as they could do. I think they're really important because this is what they do. They get your paper to the right person. So often journals have a person who specializes in a particular area. And it's sad to say they either get rejected quickly, which I know is better than getting rejected slowly. It's not great. You'd rather it didn't happen, but it means things don't sit around forever. It gets on to the next stage as quickly as possible. And so journals do pay attention to these things. I am really keen on reporting. And I think I would say this is the thing I see all the time is that there's a lot of poor quality research, but many people, many academics really do themselves down by not reporting their research well. And there are lots of good guidelines around for this. So this is just an example of a structured abstract from the MJA. I'm a big fan of structured abstracts, and there's some key bits to it that kind of make it really easy to understand what was done. So for example, you've got the title in the study design in the title, you've got the objectives, you've got who it was done in, the settings, participants, you know what the outcome measures were, you've got the results, you've got the conclusion, and then right down at the bottom you've got the trial registration. So you can kind of, that's a really good snapshot of what's in the paper. Papers come in like that, it makes them really easy to be assessed. There are lots of guidelines for doing this kind of thing. This is what actually a guideline for reporting of abstracts themselves, both for conference abstracts but also for journals. It's part of a whole set of guidelines written on this thing called the Equator Network that I'd really encourage you to have a look at, because it really helps if you report your research according to these guidelines, that the journals can assess them much more thoroughly than otherwise. And then just one thing finally to think about is credit taxonomy, which is a different way of authorship, which makes sure that everybody who's involved in a research paper gets the credit associated with what they did. So a lot of journals are now asking for this. I won't talk about this in any length, but I just want you to have a think about the incentive structure. I'm involved in something called DORA, the Declaration on Research Assessment, and we wrote this blog a couple of years ago which talks about the kind of the intersection between research assessment, open scholarship and equity. And I think that one of the key things I've always found is that having academics, particularly early career academics, sort of advocating this space makes it possible for us to think, you know, much more critically about open scholarship in a way that, you know, means that we don't end up with perverse incentives as we have in the current system, as we know. So I will stop there and happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Ginny. Just a quick reminder that we'll be doing questions at the end. So if you have any questions for Ginny, could you pop them in the Q&A box as you think of them? All right, our next speaker today is Dr. Will Harrison. Will is a research fellow and lecturer at the University of Queensland, where he leads the Visual Cognition Lab. He's also an editor for the journal Eye Perception. Over to you, Will.
Thank you very much. Can I just get a thumbs up if people can hear me? Hopefully they can. Thanks. All right. So I'm going to be, this segues, I think, somewhat nicely from Ginny's presentation there. I'm focusing specifically on writing cover letters to scientific journals. It is a bit of an art, and it's one of those things that I think is, in my opinion, it's absolutely critical, but we're certainly not taught it in undergrad, where I went to university. And then I think the only reason I learned it was because during my PhD, I happened to be in a lab where people knew about cover letters. I've certainly spoken to colleagues from overseas who have no sort of appreciation or realization of the important role that cover letters play in scientific publishing. So I guess my goal today is really just a very general introduction into what cover letters are, why they're important, and maybe what you can do to try to write a cover letter that will have the kind of impact that you're hoping for. Before I start, there's one big caveat to what I'm going to talk about today. If you're watching this seminar in the hope that you're going to see the best science-based practice when it comes to cover writing, you can mute Zoom right now, because there is no empirical basis on which I'm going to be talking about cover letters today. Okay, so I would love to give you an evidence-based seminar on the best way to write cover letters. It's not going to be that. It's going to be my experience, it's going to be my anecdotes, and it's going to be my opinions. So of course, take this with a grain of salt. I hope that my tips are useful, but of course, like everything that's anecdotal, you know, you've got to really judge for yourself. Now, with that caveat said, I'm going to pretend as though I know exactly how to write good cover letters, and so tune in for the actual tips. I was going to start off by asking for a show of hands. I don't know if this will work on Zoom, but are people able to, maybe you're not even allowed to give a thumbs up when we're in this presenter mode, but I was going to ask, just even before I define what I mean by a cover letter, I was curious in just about the number of people who are consistently writing cover letters when they submit to journals. I can see, at least in the hosts, a lot of people are putting their hands up. I don't know if people, oh, there we go. Yeah, so I can see some hands come out now in the attendees. So if you click the raise hand button, if you are already, whatever cover letter means to you, put your hands up. Excellent. Okay, I can see there's 19, about 18 out of 46, 19 out of 46. So around about half the people are putting their hands up. Now, maybe the other half of the people know about cover letters, or they just haven't submitted anything yet, or they don't know about cover letters, okay? I'm specifically going to be talking about writing cover letters for relatively high impact journals. So what do I mean by cover letter? When submitting a manuscript to a scientific journal, you can also submit an accompanying letter, and that's the cover letter, that the journal editor will see. Some journals require a cover letter as part of the submission, and I'll talk about that a bit more later. Usually, but not always, only the editor will see the letter. The reviewers typically do not see the cover letter. There are, of course, exceptions to this. I know as a fact that some journal editors, they will forward the cover letter to expert reviewers to help them make a decision, to help the editors make a decision. So when you're thinking about cover letters, you're really targeting an editor, but you also have to bear in mind that other people might see the cover letter as well. There are rarely guidelines about what to include in a cover letter, at least useful guidelines. You know, if you look at guidelines, I think Current Biology still has guidelines. They basically just say, you know, summarize what you've discovered and why that's important, or something like that, right? It's much more difficult than the guidelines. I think it's much more difficult than the guidelines make it sound. Depending on the journal that you're submitting to, the cover letter will determine whether or not your manuscript is sent out to review. Whether you like that or not, that is factually true. The cover letter, just the cover letter, will determine whether or not your manuscript is seen by reviewers at some journals. Okay. Impact factors are gross, they're flawed. We know that they're not a good representation of the quality of the science, okay, but at least it's a number that we can arrange on a line, like some kind of continuum, to sort of start thinking about the range of journals that we might publish in science, in particular my area, which I call cognitive neuroscience, or, you know, perceptual sciences. And so you can imagine down in the lower end of impact factors, we have journals that are really dedicated to very, very specific topics that are probably only read by a small collection of experts in a niche area. For example, you could have the Journal of Gabor Wavelet Design for Modeling Contrast Detection and Noise. I've made that journal title up, but I really now want it to exist, because that's exactly the kind of thing I like studying. So something like that, it's going to be relatively low impact. And then, of course, at the other end of the impact factor, we can have journals that you just slap on the word nature. If you've got the Nature Gabor Wavelet Design for Modeling Contrast Detection and Noise, all of a sudden the impact factor is going to be, you know, 1 million, right? But you can have a range of different impact factors across journals, and this does kind of help to track the relevance of a cover letter. So I'm trying to plot the importance of cover letters mapped out as a function of impact factor. Again, this is not based on science. This is based on my anecdote. And I think the importance of cover letters looks something like this. So for really relatively low impact factor journals, cover letters aren't important. But somewhere between, I would say, an impact factor of 3 and maybe 7, journals with an impact factor between 3 or 7, cover letters become incredibly important. And then they're consistently important for all, all journals above that mark. So it's a step function. It's not a linear function, the importance of cover letters. Of course, we can debate this if you wanted, but, in terms of broad strokes, I think this is probably correct. Personally, I find the idea of prestige in publishing, it's kind of gross. I would much prefer, when I'm applying for grants or for jobs or whatever, I would much rather people actually read my work and judge my work based on the quality of the science rather than the prestige of the journal. But the reality is prestige does matter in the world that we have today as scientists, and it probably will for a while yet. It's very hard to ask a collection of, for example, grant reviewers to just ignore the fact that you've got some publications in Nature, as in terms of the psychology, those kinds of prestigious things will stick out, and they will probably make a difference in how people evaluate the quality of your science, right? That sucks, but it's the reality. And to publish in these sorts of higher impact journals or prestige journals, you have to nail the cover letter. It's absolutely critical to nail the cover letter because it's what stands between your manuscript and getting your manuscript reviewed at that journal. So what role does the cover letter play? The cover letter is an important opportunity for you to summarize your key findings to the editor so they don't have to be an expert in your area to understand your entire manuscript. This, I think, is a true description of the role of cover letters, but I would say that's not the mindset that you need to adopt when you're writing a cover letter for impact. Instead, what I do for myself is I try to adopt this mindset. The cover letter is my one and only chance to convince the editor that they would be crazy not to publish or at least review my manuscript. It can't just be a summary of the cool science that I've done in the manuscript. The cover letter has to stand alone and essentially, metaphorically punch the editor in the face with how important the work is. If you can't convince yourself of the importance of your own work, then to write the cover letter, then that's probably indicative of the kinds of journals that you could think about publishing in instead, where cover letters play less of a role. So in thinking about how, in preparing for this this seminar, I was sort of reflecting upon the cover letters that I've written, and I've got a handful of publications in high impact journals. Ruben and I have just recently published something at Nature Communications, where the cover letter played an important role. If you look at my CV, not all of my papers get in high impact journals, even though I've submitted a lot of them to high impact journals. But I do think that the information I'm going to show on the next couple of slides, it is the approach that I've taken, and I do get past the editor more often than I end up getting published in those journals. So even though I don't have an incredibly outstanding CV, I do think I know how to write a cover letter to get past the editor. And so I've tried to distill, I guess, the essence of my strategy as these ingredients. And really what it comes down to for me in the cover letter is telling a story. And that kind of makes the exercise a little bit easier because stories can be really formulaic in how they're written. And I looked at a couple of different cover letters that I've written for different papers across different years and different journals. And I think I actually, implicitly, I've been following this exact same formula for all of my cover letters for at least the last 10 years. Okay, so when we're telling a story, if you think about this almost like a piece of cinema, we always start with a movie trailer, right? There's a preview. And I literally mean if you're writing a cover letter to the editor, like a document that you're going to submit to the journal, you can give the editor a bit of a teaser, right? You want to tease the reader very early on. You want to grab their attention in the first couple of sentences, and you want to summarize your discovery in exciting terms. It's very common to start off a letter with something like, "Dear editor, please find attached this article that we're submitting for your consideration at the journal." Okay, fine. You could delete that sentence. What's much more important is what comes after it. Why would the editor keep reading the rest of this cover letter? Smash them in the face with metaphorically, sorry, I shouldn't use such a violent metaphor, astound them with something exciting in terms of your science. Then you need to set the scene. What is the current state of our understanding? This is actually really tricky to do because as experts who are publishing papers, we have such a huge amount of knowledge in our head that both very broad and very deep. But in a cover letter, you really need to set the scene in just a couple of sentences. What is the current state of understanding that if you ask, your rival scientists, would they agree with your summary of the state of theoretical knowledge that you've summarized in the letter? I use the scene to then create a mystery. This is almost like the end of Act 1 in a script. What is missing from the theory? Given that we've set the stage for the state-of-the-art knowledge, what questions are left over, or what is yet to be understood, maybe because we don't have the technology to understand it, or because there's some kind of theoretical debate or whatever. You create a mystery early on, and of course, the punchline is, and the editor will know this, that you're solving that mystery. And so you can give the spoiler again after you've set up the mystery. You want to restate your new conclusion. Okay, so the state of the understanding is one thing, but it leaves open this other thing. And now we've solved that problem too. We've got this holistic understanding of this entire body of work. And then you can explain how you got there, right? You can explain how you got to your conclusion. What was the critical thing that you did that no one else did before? Now, this is tempting to get into the methodological detail. You don't want to do that. You want to keep it really high level, but you want to make it very clear that you're a genius for thinking of whatever you thought of that nobody else has thought of before. And you need to make it sound like it's time urgent. Why does this need to be published right now, right? You've got to put that pressure on the editor that, wow, if they don't publish it, they're going to look like a fool in a couple of years' time when this becomes one of the most highly cited papers. And you also want to let the editor know who your audience is, what areas of science will be affected by your new knowledge. If it's just the dozen people who study your very specific topic, then it's not suitable for that journal. You need to be able to describe your audience as being incredibly vast for it to warrant consideration in a high impact journal that has a general readership. I didn't have the, I wasn't organized enough to get permission from any of my co-authors, my colleagues, to share an example of a cover letter that I've actually submitted. But I submitted these exact tips, these formula into ChatGPT and got it to write a cover letter. And I've got to say, with almost zero detail about, this hypothetical study, I think ChatGPT writes really good cover letters. You can get that example specifically. I've shared this ChatGPT example very explicitly, and it's actually broken down the cover letter into each of these these tips that I've kind of outlined, and it's done a really good job of keeping the language very high level so that the reader doesn't have to be an expert in vision science. They don't have to be an expert in Bayesian statistics. They can still understand why this idea is important and timely and potentially going to be groundbreaking moving forward. Okay, I've got just a couple of slides left. I think one of the mistakes I've made earlier on in my cover letters is thinking that I can kind of outsmart the editor. And I think that's a really, that was a big mistake of mine. Editors are incredibly smart and they're incredibly experienced at reading summaries of research. And so what you want to do is you want to walk right up to the edge of overstating the importance of your study, but you don't want to cross over it. I think that can backfire. If you oversell your research, that's only going to hurt you when the editor or peer reviewers scratch the surface of your claims. So humility is important. Don't pretend that related work doesn't exist or isn't important. Be explicit in your cover letter if there's related work, but then you just need to state clearly and concisely why related work doesn't solve the mystery that you've set up. Don't get into the weeds. The editor does not want a literature review of an esoteric debate within a subfield. They want big picture stuff. You really shouldn't be talking about specific methods, for example, in a cover letter. You shouldn't be talking about the statistical tests that you did. That's all way too detailed for a cover letter. Cite relevant work. I always, in the cover letter, literally in the cover letter, I always aim to cite papers in prestige journals to demonstrate that the topic is impactful, and I include a reference section in the cover letter. I pilot my cover letters. If you can't convince your own co-authors or even yourself that your cover letter makes a compelling case for impact, then the editor's not going to be convinced either. Finally, I'm a big fan of aesthetics. Humans will automatically judge some, kind of qualitative label to something just on the appearance. So I always try to make my cover letters look professional. I always use a formal letterhead of my current affiliation, and I format the cover letter. So literally on the first fixation of the cover letter, it just looks like a document that people might want to read. Okay. And so finally, it should take up about a page, a full sort of A4 page. Sometimes I write a page and a half, but you don't want to write more or less than is needed to just hit those main tips. Final slide. If you want to publish in gross prestige journals, high impact journals, you have to take the cover letter very, very seriously. But like all skills, it takes a lot of practice. I spend usually over a week at least writing cover letters. I iterate them to death, and I write different versions of the story. I don't rush it. I don't force it. You've probably spent over a year doing the science. Don't then try to write a cover letter in a day. Like, give the cover letter the time that it needs to write it well. And remember, rejection is a fact of science. It sucks. Don't take it personally. Having a submission rejected or rejected after review is not a reflection of you. It's a reflection on the silly system we've created for academic publishing. So be kind to yourself in trying to get cover letters to your editor and getting your manuscript in the hands of reviewers. Thanks very much. Sorry, I went a bit long there, folks.
Thank you so much, Will. That was really informative. Okay, so our final speaker today is Professor Simine Vazire. Simine is a professor of psychology at the University of Melbourne and is editor-in-chief of Collabora Psychology, an open access psychology journal. Over to you, Simine.
Great, thanks so much. So I'm editor of Collabora now, and before that I was editor-in-chief of Social, Psychological, and Personality Science, which is a subscription, so not open access journal. So my background is going to come from those experiences, as well as being on publication committees, on the board of PLOS and other things like that, but all the opinions are mine. I'm going to talk really fast to try to save us some time for Q&A. So first I'll start with maybe a different view than Will's, but I think that he made the point that it really varies by journal and by journal impact. So the journals that I've been involved with, the editors skim the cover letter and it's not a big part of the peer review process. And I would say for the journals that I'm familiar with, I wouldn't put anything only in the cover letter. So if there's important information that you want to communicate it in the article itself, if there's something that you really want the editor to know, it might be worth emailing them. If there's a specific issue, but I think cover letters, many journals, cover letters get skimmed, and most of what gets paid attention to is just the submission itself and any contact during the peer review process, like the back and forth with the reviewers and authors. Okay, so I'm going to kind of go through some decision points as an author that you're making as you're going through the peer review process, and then I'll talk a little bit about, as a reviewer, some issues that you might be facing. So as an author, first is writing your paper, and I think there's a few tensions, some of which were alluded to earlier, in terms of what's in your interest as an author. So one is how transparent to be. So obviously some journals require some levels of transparency, like posting your data, maybe even sharing your design analysis plan ahead of time, registering it, things like that. But many journals don't have requirements. They might have badges or prefer more transparency, things like that. So deciding how transparent to be is going to be a difficult decision, and the self-interested aspect of it can be really complicated. I would, of course, on principle, I'm for transparency, but I think we need to be honest that transparency is a complicated issue and that it can put you at a disadvantage during the peer review process at some journals. And that relates to another point, which is going to be, it really depends what journal you want to submit to, what kind of journal you want to submit to, what your values are as a researcher, what values you want the journal to share with you. And so you have a lot of control as a researcher where you submit your work is considered something that, journals are fighting for the best work happening out there. So think about what journals you want to reward with submitting your work to them. We don't often think of it that way, right? We think of the journal as having all the power, but actually researchers who do good research have a lot of power by choosing where to submit that good research. Journals are kind of fighting for the best research. So you have power there. You have power to choose journals that will reward the things that you want to be rewarded for. If that's transparency, great. Another kind of tension that Will alluded to, or Will talked about, is the tension between wanting to really make the best case possible for your work without exaggerating. And I think, again, this is an area where what's rewarded by journals is going to vary across journals, and it may sometimes be in tension with what's best for science. So I think some journals and some editors are more likely to reward hype and exaggeration. Other journals are more likely to punish researchers who go too far and exaggerate too much. So again, that might be something you think about as you choose where to submit. What kind of journal do you want to support by submitting your work there? And what kind of behavior on your part do you want the journal to be rewarding versus disincentivizing? Another important thing in choosing where to submit your work is looking at the journal's policies, what they say they value, but also keeping in mind that journal policies can come apart from journal practices. So in addition to looking at what they say they're looking for, what kind of research they say they want to publish, also look at what research they've published recently. Are they publishing research that you think is high quality, that you would be proud to be among those other articles? Do they seem to be selecting for the kinds of things that you think are good research practices that you want to be rewarded for? So don't just go with what they say their policies or guiding principles are. Look at what they're actually publishing. One thing some people do sometimes is send a pre-submission inquiry. So email the editor or somebody at the journal to ask if their paper is in scope or if it's relevant. I would strongly discourage that unless they say that they want that. So as an editor, getting those emails is annoying. I basically have to, if I were to respond thoroughly, I would have to look at your paper as closely as if you had submitted it. That's kind of asking me to do work outside of the system. So submit your paper and then I'll be happy to evaluate it. If you have a really concrete question about, do you accept neuroscience papers, for example, that's easy to answer, but don't send an attachment of your paper. And I would say, don't even send like a long paragraph description of your paper, because that's not what, that should happen within the submission system. And journals usually are pretty clear about their scope on their website. So you don't need to ask if your paper sounds like it's within scope. You may have an option to do master review or not. It's sometimes called blinding, where your identity as authors is hidden from reviewers. So again, that depends on your own values. I would keep in mind that many journal editors, most of them are human, and so that means that they are swayed by status. So I'm in favor of masking the author's identities from reviewers, because I think that it's easier to then evaluate the work on its own merits. But again, think about your values, think about what you and your co-authors want, how you want to be evaluated. Okay, so once you submit, the cover letter issue, I think, varies by journal. I would consider Will's advice if you're submitting to a really, really competitive journal where you're likely to get an editor that's not in your field or not going to see the value of your work. Otherwise, I wouldn't spend too much time on the cover letter personally. You may also, as part of the submission process, be asked to nominate reviewers, and also you might have the opportunity to nominate reviewers that you don't want, opposed reviewers. I would be really careful in this, so make sure when you nominate reviewers that you don't nominate anyone with a conflict of interest. The journal might have a specific set of guidelines about conflicts of interest, but a good general rule is nobody that the co-authors, you or your co-authors, are currently collaborating with or have collaborated with in the last 4 years, nobody at the same institution as you or your co-authors, nobody that you've ever mentored or have been mentored by, nobody that you have a close relationship with, like a family relationship, romantic relationship, and nobody who'd be perceived as having a conflict of interest for some reason. For opposed reviewers, I would again be really careful about this. I tend to find it somewhat off-putting when researchers put opposed reviewers, especially if it's clear that the main opposition is just an intellectual one. That's what reviews are for. It's fine to tell editors in your cover letter, for example, that this camp is, intellectually opposed to your work. That's fine, but they're still allowed to solicit reviews from that camp. It's good for them to have the context. So then another question authors sometimes have is, after I've submitted my manuscript, how long is it reasonable to wait? And at what point can I nudge the editor or the journal to ask if my paper fell between the cracks? And I think people here are too shy to do this. So I think it's okay to send a very short, polite email to the editor. I would say after maybe 4 months, if you haven't heard back. Sometimes you can also see the status of your manuscript. If you can see that it hasn't moved at all after something like 4 months, I think it's reasonable to nudge. Again, this varies by journal, but sometimes papers do fall through cracks. And so I don't think it's impolite to just ask politely every once in a while. Okay, then you get a decision. So what do you do when you get a decision? So if you get a rejection, one question that authors sometimes has is it okay to appeal a rejection? So I've heard very mixed things about this. In my experience as an editor, it's quite rare. So while it's true that some people do, and some people use this option a lot, the vast majority of people do not appeal editor decisions. So be aware that you would be in a really small minority if you appeal a decision. I think personally, again, if it's done politely, it can be okay, but you have to be able to take no for an answer. I think the only case where it's well justified is if there was an objective error, and especially if the objective error was on the part of the editor. So if a reviewer made an error, then you have to decide, did it seem like the editor's decision was heavily influenced by that error? If not, it's probably not worth pointing out. But if it was, or if the editor themselves made an error and it's really black and white, so I would talk to colleagues who are not on your paper and ask them for honest feedback, give them the decision letter, point out the error, and see if they agree that it's an objective error before appealing to the journal. If you got, well, you probably wouldn't have gotten an acceptance on the first decision. That's extremely rare. So the best case scenario, you got to revise and resubmit. One common thing I've seen authors do is interpret a revise and resubmit as a rejection. Anything that is not a rejection is a revise and resubmit. If there's any door open for you to resubmit, you have that option. It's not always super explicit. Often the letter can sound quite negative, but then at the bottom, there's instructions for how to submit your revision. That's a revise and resubmit. In some cases, they might ask for major revisions, maybe things that you don't want to do. And so you want to think about it, do you want to continue with this process? Another option that I think people often don't realize is an option is that you can contact the editor. So let's say they asked you for new data, or they asked you to change the framing in a way that you don't want to change. And it sounds like that's something they're insisting on for a revision. If you're not willing to do that, but you want to make absolutely sure that you're not walking away for the wrong reasons, you could contact the editor and say, just to be clear, it's my understanding that you would require this change. So if we're not willing to make that change, it's not worth resubmitting, or, there's ways to ask that. But in most cases, a revise and resubmit would involve changes, a combination of changes that the authors are happy to make, changes that they might have good arguments against. But in most cases, we would expect authors to make the most of the changes, especially the changes that the editor highlighted or specifically requested. If the editor didn't point out one of the reviewer's points specifically, it's possible that the editor doesn't feel strongly that you need to do that. In some cases, they may even disagree with the reviewer and not have said so explicitly, because their letter also goes to reviewers. And so they're managing this delicate relationship where they're grateful to the reviewers. They want the reviewers to keep doing service for that journal. And so if they disagree with the reviewer's point, you might have to read between the lines to see that. So in a revision, I would prioritize making the changes that the editor pointed out. And then the changes also that you agree with, that you think really do improve the paper, those are the easy changes to make, right? Then the question becomes the changes that you're kind of neutral about. You don't necessarily think they improve the paper, but you're fine making them. I would make those changes. And then there's changes that you might be opposed to making that you think make the paper worse. And those are worth arguing. So there is room for negotiation in a revise and resubmit. And this is where the cover letter, I think, is really, really, really important. So in a revision, you will always submit a response letter. And in that response letter, I would encourage you to literally copy and paste everything from the editorial decision letter and the reviews without changing it, and then add in your responses after each point by the editor and the reviewers in a way that's really easy to read. Maybe the text is in different colors for the stuff that you copied and pasted versus your response. It's offset, it's indented, etc. Make it really easy for the editor to read that response letter and see exactly how you responded to each point. So how you responded could be, we added several paragraphs, see page 7, or it could be, you could be arguing back saying, we didn't actually make this change, here are reasons why. You want to be really polite in that letter, but you want to make sure you're not hiding anything. So the editor is going to be relying heavily on that letter. And if it feels like it's misleading, or you deleted a point that you really needed to respond to, or you're hand wavy in your response, then the editor is going to have a much harder job, and that might affect their decision in the end. So when you send in your revision, you want to make it as easy as possible for the editor to understand how you responded to each of the comments by them and the reviewer. That letter, the response letter to a revision, may or may not go to the reviewers as well. Your whole submission may or may not go back to the reviewers, but even if the reviewers get the revision, they may not get the cover letter, the response letter. Okay, and then I'll mention a few innovations that are happening in peer review that are relevant to authors. So one is preprints. As Ginny mentioned, you can already get feedback on your paper, get it kind of peer reviewed informally by posting it as a preprint, and if it gets uptake. Another is an initiative called Reviewer Zero, where you can get feedback on your paper before you send it out for peer review, and it's especially targeted at groups that are less likely to be able to have connections to receive that feedback. And I'll put the link in the chat if I can figure out. Here we go. Oh, maybe I'll put in the chat to the host and panelists. If someone could share it in the chat to everybody, that would be great. There's also registered reports, which is where you submit your manuscript before you collect the data. So you write out your proposal for what you want to do, and you get peer review then, which is really valuable because you can update your research plan according to the feedback that you get. The other benefit of that is that the journal, if they like your proposal after some revisions, they would give you an in-principle acceptance and commit to publishing the results regardless of how they turn out. So it removes some of the pressures to kind of massage your data or oversell it. Some journals offer streamlined review, which is where you can submit your manuscript along with a rejection from another journal, as long as it went out for review. You submit the decision letter and the reviews, and that gives that new journal the option to not send it back out for review if they feel like the reviews are thorough. And you would submit it also with a response letter articulating how you revised your manuscript in response to all those letters. So that helps streamline and speed up the process. And more there's platforms for journal agnostic review. So where you can get peer review and you can then go and publish in any of a number of journals. The peer review is not linked to a specific journal. So Peer Community In is one of those platforms, and there's different peer communities. So there's a peer community in registered reports, for example, but there are also peer communities in substantive areas of research. So you might check if there's one in your area of research. Okay, a couple of things I wanted to say also is that there's a lot of stuff going on in the background of journals that might be less noble and idealistic than I think we imagine. So there's a lot of, journals are struggling to get a reputation, and in some ways what they're trying to maximize isn't always what's best for science and what's best for the researchers submitting to their journals. So journals might be interested in maximizing their impact factor, and Ginny talked a little bit about the problems with that kind of ranking, and that motivates journals and editors to publish things that they think are going to get a lot of traction, which means like really cutting edge stuff and rewarding authors who kind of oversell their research and present it as completely groundbreaking. Some of that research really is groundbreaking. It's not oversold, but also a lot of that research turns out to be wrong, turns out to be too good to be true in various ways. And that's something that as an author, you're kind of sucked into that system where journals are fighting for a higher ranking and so on that. There are some developments to try to reduce that pressure, and that's basically one of the few rankings that exist for journals is the journal impact factor. But now there are more metrics being developed that reward different kinds of things. So for example, there's the transparency and openness promotion guidelines that's associated with the top factor. So each journal gets a score on how much its policies promote transparency and openness. Another issue is that there's not a lot of pressure on journals themselves to be transparent and open. There's more and more on them to require researchers and authors to be transparent and open, but there's still a lot of closed stuff happening at journals. So we still don't really know a lot about how journal policies get set, what journals do when errors are pointed out in their papers. We know that it's very, very slow to get anything corrected or retracted at journals. Now there's some journals that offer transparent peer review, which is where the peer review history, the editor's decisions and the reviewer's comments get published together with the published paper. And so that provides some more transparency and accountability. We can see how thorough the peer review process was, but it's still relatively rare that journals offer that. Journals and editors have to think about things like what they want their rejection rate and acceptance rate to be. And there's some pressure to be very selective just for the sake of being selective. And then this question of what the ideal balance of reject without review or reject is, especially as the reviewer shortage becomes a bigger and bigger problem. It's really hard to find reviewers. So there's more and more kind of incentive or pressure to reject papers without review, to not burden reviewers with papers that have a low chance of ever being accepted. So journals and editors are dealing with all those things in the background. How can they boost their impact factor? What responsibility do they have to ask for openness? What rejection rate they want? What they should do? They're getting people telling them that there's problems in their published papers, and they're trying to juggle that as well as managing the papers that are coming in. And that's I don't mean to say that they have a lot of good reasons for not doing those things well. They are taking on a lot of tasks, journal editors, but it is also their responsibility. And I think that we should expect more of journals. But the reality is that very often some of these things are really, really slow to change, and journal editors themselves sometimes respond to incentives that are not great for science. So it's something to keep in mind that, the whole process is not as perfect as we might want it to be, that there are a lot of other influences on editors' decisions. Okay, sorry, I ended up talking for longer than I hoped, but I'll wrap up there.
All right, thank you so much, Simine. So I know that both Ginny and Simine are on deadlines and have to head off at 1 p.m. So we're probably not going to have too much time for questions. So first of all, thank you so much, Ginny, for answering the questions that came through in the chat. If anyone else has any questions that they haven't put in the Q&A box yet, please feel free to raise your hand, or I think we've got some questions from the committee, which we can turn to. So how about, first of all, sorry. All right, first of all, we got a couple of questions for Will. First of all, Will, what do you think about using figures in a cover letter? And you mentioned using formal letterhead. So strategically, if you're not from a group of 8 university, do you think it's better to use a non-formal letterhead? That question is open to anyone, but we're specifically targeted at Will initially.
I'll just keep this brief. The second part about not being in a GO8 university, I really hope that doesn't matter. It's not about trying to brag about your affiliation. It's literally making the cover letter look professional, right? So we don't have control usually over what university we're currently at. I mean, ECRs don't usually have control. So I would say for ECRs, don't feel insecure about your affiliation. You're doing good science no matter where you are. So do that. And then the first part was using figures. I've put figures in cover letters before. I think in general, if you can't make the case concisely in a couple of paragraphs, figures are probably not going to help you. It would have to be a very, very critical figure that explains a lot very intuitively to warrant putting a figure in a cover letter.
All right, thanks. Simine, did you have any other thoughts on those topics?
No.
Nope. Okay. Thank you. Are there any other questions from the audience for the time being, or given it's 1 o'clock and pretty quiet, should we consider wrapping up? Oh, there's another question just come through for all of panelists. This person says that they really like the idea and the process behind peer community and they'd like to start using such platforms potentially exclusively. Is there any disadvantage to that?
Yeah, I would say one big disadvantage is that there aren't that many prestigious journals yet that are that accept manuscripts that went through peer review at PCI. There's more and more, every day, and actually some in psychology, I'd say, so peer community and registered reports, for example, there's quite a range of journals in terms of prestige. Still, you're limiting which journals you'll ultimately publish in to the ones that are PCI interested or PCI friendly, which means slightly different things, but it means that they consider journals that went through PCI. So especially if you're early in your career, limiting yourself just to those journals might be a pretty big disadvantage. But I think that's the main one.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think we had a hand raised in the audience and that we're just allowing Alexander to speak with his question.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
I was just wondering, so I was looking at some journals, some open access journals in there. I saw, I was specifically looking at an MIT Press, Open Minds journal, and they tout themselves as being a diamond open access. With no charges even in some cases. But then I looked in and found they still have a copyright agreement where you transfer your copyright to them. I was just wondering if you had any idea why a journal would try and be a diamond open access journal, but then also want your copyright. Just if anyone has any thoughts on that, I was just very confused about it.
I don't know. Unfortunately, Ginny left. I'm surprised. Yeah, I think of open access journals as letting authors keep the copyright, so I haven't heard of that.
All good, thank you.
Right. I think it's been a little quiet on the questions front for a minute, so if nobody has anything else, I'd like to really thank Simine, Will, and also Ginny, who has had to leave, for their time. We've all learned a lot today and it's been very beneficial. Thank you so much. And yeah, please feel free to go and enjoy some lunch, I imagine. Thank you.
Thanks.